Oh, they explode that big, huh? Welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind. This time, the Wheel of Jobs decided that we play White Mage on the Monday evening, just before 7.1 drops. And, as is tradition with going in Mentor Roulette as a healer, is whoopsie, that's a lot of dungeons. With that said, we start off with Duty 1 being 1000 Maws of Toto-Rak. The tank was amazingly good at using their defensives regularly, those they had anyway. The only thing that stood out a bit as a really minor issue to me was that they didn't sprint nearly as often as they could have, and sometimes would sprint right after entering combat instead of before. This matters because sprint lasts 20 seconds when activated while not in combat, but only 10 seconds if you use it when you're already in combat. So if you're going to sprint right at the start of the fight anyway, you could easily sprint 10 seconds sooner. For White Mage specific stuff, the job is a bit limited in this level range, having only Cure and Medica for healing. However, Aero doing 50 potency up front and being a 300 potency dot makes it decently good for spreading while running, and if you run out of targets to apply to, it is an okay spammable attack to use on the move as well. 50 potency is better than 0 after all. To maximize your performance, be sure to make the most of each Cure cast as best you can. Early in the dungeon, I cast a Cure on the tank that wasn't really needed, just to see how much it heals for. Once you know how much it heals for, try your best to use Cure only either when the full healing of Cure will apply with no overhealing, or if you have to. If the enemies are somehow barraging the tank so hard that they need full HP for safety, then do that. Sometimes, depending on the tank's gear, they might also have so little HP that waiting until Cure gets full value puts the tank in a dangerous position, so that might not always be optimal either. For Duty 2, we went to Skydeep Cenote, and at first, I noticed the pulls were weirdly difficult, that my cooldowns were being stretched thin. Then I noticed that the pulls were taking way longer than usual. You might have already noticed the problem if you know anything about Black Mage. At the early parts of the duty, our Black Mage lamented that they hate this dungeon as a caster, noting that the final boss is too hard in some respects. I sort of just semi-agree with them. It is a challenging boss, but saying it isn't would just cause them to complain more loudly. However, right after the second boss, the tank pulls the one pack, and the Black Mage puts down ley lines, and then the tank keeps going because normally there would be 2 packs in most dungeons, and there is so much corridor. It is a very common pulling mistake in this dungeon. My advice is that you can pull the mobs up the corridor so there's less running later, I guess, but most of the time, simply fighting this pack where it is the easiest, of course. As the tank, try to gauge whether your team is waiting for you to go or not. If they're waiting, keep going so you can show them there is no more. If they're already blasting, stay put. However, the fact the Black Mage put down ley lines made me look at the Black Mage, because I was thinking of how unfortunate it was that they lost their ley lines to this move, and that's when I saw it. This Black Mage had basically been casting Blizzard 4 and Freeze the entire dungeon. That would explain why the pulls drag on for so long. I asked them if they had a reason for not using fire and lightning spells at all, and well, they did. Supposedly, it takes time to change, and that it reduces damage dealt. I responded by saying that they do way more damage and that perhaps it would be high time to look at a guide or something, mainly because at this level there's way too much for me to teach them to even start, so it would be easier to simply direct them to look into it, considering how far off track they were. However, nay, they said. In fact, as we all know, if it isn't your main, then obviously you have no obligation to other players to even try to play your job correctly. This person is a tank main, so they're completely excused and can play Black Mage as terribly as they like. And that, besides, the difference isn't that big between casting only B4 and Freeze versus, you know, using your toolkit. I know, in fairness, they were using Foul and Xenoglossy, I believe, but still. I then responded that not only is the difference massive, but it was very noticeable. Like, I'm curious how the fact I asked wasn't indication enough that it was a noticeable difference. I might have said more if they didn't flee out the dungeon the moment it finished, but I'm just saying, and this one goes out to anyone who feels like doing a duty without even having the slightest idea how their job works. No one is demanding that you play the job perfectly. No one is demanding that you play super well, but at least trying to be prepared when you go and play with other players is the most considerate thing. I don't care whether you want to be a master at the job or not, but you can at least try to do the basics, right? I would guess, just at a glance, that the duty took about 30% longer than it needed to, and I don't know whether that's partly thanks to me, the tank, or the Viper, but knowing how off track the Black Mage was, it is pretty easy to pin most or all of the blame on them. I don't mind that a duty takes 30% longer than they would need to, but I would prefer if the reason for that is someone actually not being good at the game and needing the practice, and not someone just being too lazy to give it a try. I would also say both the tank and the Viper were doing really well, no personal complaints there. Also, finally, for a more positive note, a tip for the final boss. A substantial amount of players have issues with this boss, I've heard. The weirdly common complaint being that, quote-unquote, you need to see the future to beat it. I'm guessing this is related to the double half-room cleaves. When the boss charges up this attack, one of the fists will have a beam point to it and glow first, and then the other. The one that glows first punches first. For Duty 3, we went to Zormor, and it turned out Rory knew me. Hello. On the first boss, a weird tip is that even if the boss eats the Hornets, it increases the damage of, predominantly, its raid-wide attack, which it might use once in the fight, and when it does, it resets the buff. Add to this that the buff is very, very weak, so you can pretty safely ignore the Hornets and focus on the boss. On the second boss, it turned out our Black Mage didn't quite seem to know what a stack marker is, which is a bit surprising considering the rest of the party basically demonstrated how to deal with it right in front of their nose earlier in the fight. Because they fled with the marker, we unfortunately decided to let them deal with it alone. On the final boss, it looked almost like we missed a DPS check on the wings. Is that a thing? It looked like we took a raid-wide hit just as the second wing died. For Duty 4, we went to Ghimlyt Dark. The tank said right out the gate that they were very rusty with Warrior, so I was immediately ready to compensate if needed. However, specifically on Warrior technique, I don't think there was any issues. They were using the toolkit well. In regards to pulling, on the other hand, personally, I'm not the biggest fan of pulling all the way to the wall. Especially not as a White Mage, as I just have to wait until the tank stops moving before I can attack. I can always adjust, of course, but there is a reason why I prefer to fight the pull where the last pack happens to be. Several jobs need to stop moving to do good AoE damage. Many players will also wait until the pack stops moving before blasting. On the one hand, moving the pack all the way to the wall reduces the amount you need to run after the fight, slightly. However, you instead extend the fight by a few seconds where you run while being punched in the booty, so you're still wasting those few seconds of time when it really comes to it. Another minor issue with pulling technique is that it seemed like every time a mob would spawn into fighting us, the warrior would completely miss them for several seconds. For boss fights, it was pretty clear the machinist was a first-timer, but they were trying their best. On the second boss, they died as a result of the line AoE, you know the one. At the same time, our warrior also lost pretty much a full inner release to the boss, leaving at the worst of times. On the final boss, we also ended up not using Limit Break at all. For Duty 5, we went to St. Mocianne's Arboretum. Hard. Overall, the duty went fine, the tank was good as well. However, relatively early in the duty, I noticed that Black Mage, again the Black Mage, was doing something really weird. Notably, at times they would alternate modes repeatedly and just cast Thunderheads while just standing there. It looked so deliberate that I was certain there must be an explanation, and so I asked why they were not using things like Blizzard 4 and Fire 4. They said they were doing this to save MP to cast flares more? This answer was definitely not what I expected. Not only is this an incredibly bad way to get more flares, since you could have had more flares than that if you wanted to, but even if you could, optimally you don't want more flares on single target. So I tried my best to advise them to use Blizzard 4 and Fire 4 more without offending them. On the final boss, things got a bit sketchy thanks to the mud bombs getting a bit weird, but I was ready for it after it exploded the first time, and I might have been to blame for that one also. For Duty 6, we went to Worqor Zormor, and at this point, I assumed we have a lot of returning players with the patch coming the day after. Overall, the tank was decent, although something weird seemed to happen after the second boss, where it felt like on the packs there, the tank almost stopped using defensives altogether. I don't know if they were trying to figure out how to adjust to my stuns or what, but it certainly increased the effort I had to put in. It was also mildly amusing that it was the Bard who brought up the issue of the tank not tanking the final pack on top of the ranged mob, when the Bard was also the one consistently precasting raid buffs and sometimes misaligning Radiant Finale and Battle Voice. Like, I mean, one wrong and then another wrong. Like, you can advise others while you're doing things wrong. Like, that doesn't mean your advice is wrong. I'm just saying it's pretty funny. That said, the duty went pretty fine, with no wipes or major issues anywhere. For Duty 7, we went to Praetorium, and you would probably not be shocked to hear not much special happened here. The main thing with White Mage is that because it has basically no good OGCD healing options at this level, you need to get extra greedy to maximize damage. Optimally only using Regen and Medica 2, and only using them when as many of the party members as possible get full value out of it. This can be extra difficult to determine with healing over time. For the tradition, if White Mage was a Pokemon, I could probably envision it as a Grass Fairy type, or maybe a Grass Psychic type. I could imagine it having a decent special attack and special defense stat, leading to its moveset having a slightly more aggressive twist to it, like a Wheezing, bringing 2 defensive or support moves and 1 or 2 attack moves so the opponent doesn't get free reign on the field. What exactly those moves should be, I don't know though, but I could imagine something like Will-O-Wisp being a good idea to represent Dia. For Duty 8, we went to Hell's Lit, and it turned out Veara knew me. Hello. I noticed right at the start that it seemed like they stumbled a bit on their actions with what appeared to me as Searing Light, Energy Drain, Summon Bahamut. However, at second glance, I think that was only right then, so it was probably me messing them up initially. For the rest of the duty, they were just fine. The first boss here is a bit sneaky with the 100-ton swing, and when he throws his weapons and chases someone, be sure to run away if it is you, as you can quickly get overwhelmed otherwise. The AoE pool after the second boss is also particularly large and includes mobs that hit a bit harder than usual, as well as the serpents that do regular frontal cone attacks, so if the tank has not carefully placed them, you can quickly get in trouble as a non-tank. Also, be on your toes on the healing. For Duty 9, we went to Brayflox Longstop, hard, a reasonably challenging duty for its level. I noticed the Black Mage doing some weird things throughout the duty, with a notable one being almost exclusively using single target on AoE. I think I even saw them randomly use Umbral Soul in a boss fight while there were enemies to attack. I will say though, it seems like they were trying different things, and they are a sprout, so I feel they are sort of excused. Hopefully, they'll get better with time. More importantly though, on the final boss, it has this mechanic where the boss becomes untargetable and then rains down bombs. What you're meant to do is hit them to push back the bombs to make a safe spot for yourselves in the center of the room, as the boss is running down anyone in the outer ring. What happens for us is, we push the bombs back a bit, assuming that's good enough. Spoiler alert, it was, in fact, not good enough, and we promptly, instantly died. On the run back, we're all a lot more aggressive with pushing the bombs all the way to Narnia, just in case. I'm pretty sure I have either never seen or it has been ages since I've seen the boss summon this Giga Bomb at the end though, so I'm guessing our damage was a bit low. Still, quite funny. Finally, for Duty 10, we are an instant replacement in the Gilded Araya, which is an insanely rare duty as it is a trial you unlock through the Hildebrand story, and as there is no loot from it, you have no reason to run it twice, and it is quite late in the story too. The Spirit of Battle Awakens and the Sixfold Blade are probably the 2 hardest mechanics in the fight. The Spirit of Battle has the boss do 1 of 3 attacks, and then copy it to the big clone. After the boss demonstrates each thing, every subsequent use of this mechanic has the big clone teleport to a different corner of the arena before resolving its mechanic. Simply put, circle AoE from the boss means about max melee from the boss in the direction away from the big clone. Donut AoE from the boss means get close to the clone, although it is a bit more lenient so you can probably be in melee range of the boss. Line AoE from the boss means an extremely wide AoE from the clone. I feel players tend to underestimate that one the most. 6-fold blades technically only require 2 safe spots to alternate between, back left and back right. As these positions dodge the frontal cleave, you just need to alternate left and right depending on which of those slices come next. Remember to move as quickly as you can, as the timing can be a bit awkward. Finally, a tip based on something that happened in this run. Twice in the fight, our main tank reached 6 vulnerability stacks. This makes the auto attacks from the boss hit crazy hard, and generally, I would recommend as a tank in a duty like this to tank switch if my co-tank has more than 2 vulnerability stacks. Remember, you can always swap back once the vulnerability stacks are gone. You just don't need to both tank the boss and also deal with 6 vuln stacks. Despite not running into much in terms of difficult duties in this set, I still think we got some interesting ones. Although I am a bit shocked by how many weird black mages we had. My best advice to aspiring players wanting to learn their rotation is this. Assume all buttons in your toolkit have a purpose. There may be exceptions, but assuming you can just not use your fire spells or your thunders as a black mage is completely in the wrong direction. I would mainly recommend watching or reading a guide to be sure, but if you want to figure it out yourself, I do think a good starting point is to assume all of your tools make sense. Thunder applies a dot. It must be worth maintaining, surely. Ice magic recovers and saves MP, so that's what that is for. Fire magic only does damage and is also expensive. Surely, it has to be good damage. If you're not sure, try to pay attention to the damage numbers of your attacks to compare. I am a bit curious how you would go about explaining to a black mage that is dead set on using only ice magic, so at least try fire. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Endwalker, White Mage had an ability called Fluid Aura, which, before Shadowbringers, was a knockback. Yes, really. Before Stormblood, it even did damage, so you can imagine how fun that was for the rest of the party. Apparently, for some amount of time in Heavensward, A4, or Manipulator, could be punted around the arena using Fluid Aura.